welcome to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Academy. I'm Graham Richmond, and I'm with Alex Brown for this lesson on testing. So Alex, I know, having talked to admissions officers, we have this fun question that we ask them when we have them on our podcast. I asked them, what's the one part of the admissions process would you not want to deal with if you were applying yourself? And I swear, it's like 80% of them say, oh, I wouldn't want to take a test. So why do we have standardized tests in the admissions process? Like, what are they being used for?
We should turn around to them and say, can't you just then get rid of them?
Yeah. I
know. Testing is, well, for one thing, all candidates universally around the world will be taking the test. So, we had the admissions lesson on your sort of undergraduate record, your academic record. And when you've got candidates from all around the world doing all different types of degrees at all different universities, it is hard to get sort of really understand sort of parity across all those academic experiences. But with the standardized testing, if they're all taking, well, it used to be the same test, Graham, and we'll talk about the variety of tests that they can now take. But at least now there's a bit more of a standard measure that you can use across all candidates.
Yeah, and they've done studies that
Yes.
show that, for example, the GMAT exam is a predictor of one's ability to excel in the first year of instruction in graduate management education. So there's actual data that does suggest that it's a good measure, and you're right, it's a leveling mechanism too, I think. So whether it's the GMAT or some of the other tests out there, I think it's a nice way to compare the candidate from Brazil with a degree in finance to the candidate in New York City who studied English literature. They all have to take a test, and as you said,
art history. Yeah,
or art history, right? So, what are these tests? So there's the GMAT exam is the main exam for business school.
Yeah,
it has a verbal section, a math section. And then there's a kind of writing, and then there's also a kind of analytical section. That's obviously the schools tend to focus on the math and the verbal. Those are the primary drivers of the overall score that one gets. But what are we? There are other tests too, though. Right? So let's talk about them. So
GMAT is the sort of original test for the MBA admissions, and for many years it was the only test that schools would use in MBA admissions. Over the last several years, the landscape shifted. So now, principally because schools are trying to attract a more sort of diverse applicant pool, maybe younger applicants in these deferred programs that are looking at other master's programs. So looking at the GRE. Has sort of maybe potentially enabled them to sort of spread their nets a little bit wider. So the GRE, I'd say over the last half a dozen years, has become an acceptable sort of standardized test. Maybe if we'd have had this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, the GRE, they accept it, but it's probably better to do the GMAT because the GMAT's better understood by the admissions committees and it's the traditional test. But now we have the GRE, and again, over the last several years, it's become more acceptable across top schools. So I think they're at par now. Frankly,
I still think there's not the same percentages. Like I think it's still 70% GMAT, 30% GRE. But you're right; it's more accepted.
It's at par, I think, in terms of a tool for assessment. But it's certainly not the majority of students are using it. Still, the GMAT. The EA is another executive assessment test. This was designed for executive MBA candidates, but is now being used by some schools. Not all schools. So I'm a little bit queasy about the EA, to be frank.
Yeah, I am too. I mean, if you're looking at a full-time top MBA program, there are very few. There are only a couple really that'll take an EA. So I agree. It's sort of it's a fringe exam for now in full-time MBA admissions. Now there are waivers, right? So some schools will allow you to request to sort of opt out and say, look, I don't want to take a test. What do you think about that? I mean, that's newer, and it really was a little bit brought on by COVID, and some of these exams weren't available, and so people could kind of waive out of the test. But what's your take on the waivers?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, this has occurred over the last couple of years because of the accessibility of the test. It had been limited with the COVID crisis. So schools were like, well, we'll waive the test because we want more candidates, we want more applications, makes our statistics look good anyway for those folks. And some schools have continued to allow waivers, whereas really prior to COVID, this was a complete no-no. And I would say for most candidates, going down the waiver path is just not going to do them any good, because what you're basically, you're essentially through your application, you're offering less data points for the admissions committee to assess your candidacy. So if you are a high profile candidate and you know with great preparation you will do well in the test. So don't try to go into a test cold just because you're smart. That's not how the game works. You have to prepare super well. You get that great test score. That's a much better pathway than trying to get the waiver just because you're a chemical engineer with a 3.8 degree or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous for the most part to waive. I think if you feel that you can do the work and take the test, and I would even argue that for many schools, I'd rather see a candidate who's taken the test 2 or 3 times and their scores inched up a bit each time and they've come into the range of a school's average or whatever than someone who has a great GPA and says they want to waive. I just feel like you're right. You're giving them one less data point to work from. But it's tricky because, again, because of it's sort of a recent thing, where schools are open to it. I think that the other thing we need to talk about here is what sort of a test score do you need, right, to get into a top program? Because we see the averages at top MBA programs for the GMAT are often 720, 730. I mean, it goes up, and so I think people need to know that while you don't have to have the average score, and while no school would ever reject someone just on their GMAT score alone, that the scores matter. So it's not enough to have a 4.0 and a great GPA or something. You need to take the test and ideally do well on it and take it seriously. Yeah.
I think that last point, take it seriously. What score do you need? You need your best score.
Yeah.
That's how you should look at it. So if you're capable of getting a 760 and you got a 710, retake it and get that 760. If your limit is a 690, and you get that 690, you're still within range, but you've got your best score. That's what your focus should be on. And I think there's lots of data out there that says that folks take the test multiple times, or at least once, or at least twice. I don't know if that's the majority of folks, but it's a good portion of folks that do that. But my key piece of advice always is, I don't care how good your profile is overall, just make sure that GMAT is your best score. Just like you would make sure your essays are at their best, just like you make sure that you prep your recommenders appropriately and you did well undergrad and so on and so forth. There's no, I'm smart, I'll get through this test real quick. Yeah, it's a 710, whatever, but I get it. If that's not your best score, you're doing yourself a disservice, whether it means you're reducing your access to the very, very best school that you could have gotten into, or you're reducing your opportunity to get that scholarship dollar from the schools that you're targeting. Whatever, get your best score.
And even in some cases, and I think it's rarer now, but there are cases where companies will ask, did you take the GMAT when you applied to business school, and what did you get? And they're looking at that score too, because again, it's a nice benchmark for them to have. The test is important. It's a big piece of the puzzle. I do think that it's also something that on the margin, you want to get out of the way.
Yes.
So, and you want to leave time to take it more than once in case you have to. So I would argue if someone's looking to apply in round 1 and they're going to be working on their applications over the summer and getting them in September or October, that they need to be taking the GMAT test in the winter and spring, right? Yeah. So, or prepping. And I would argue also that it takes, you could spend 6, 8, 10 weeks preparing, doing regular kind of exercises, sample tests. You might take a course or get a tutor, whatever you need to get ready, but then know that there might be more than one sitting, and that in between the 2 sittings of the test, you're going to do some additional prep work. So it's a big piece of the, application puzzle. I always like to think of the application as it's like a multivariable equation. There's the GPA, the GMAT, your work experience, there are all these different parts. And so, as you say, get your best score, because the better it is, the better your chances are going to be at getting in. And it has these other potential applications like the recruiting market afterwards. So really important. But testing, I know I don't know that many people like to take these tests, but they're there, and you just kind of need to trudge through it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Get your best score. The other one little wrinkle just to add is submitting scores after the deadline. So at the deadline, you have to have a score, right? Otherwise, you've not got a completed application. But if at that point you're not completely satisfied with that score, there might be a rational reason why you retake the test a month later before you know the school's making any decisions, and get that new score into your profile. So there's a little wriggle room there. Schools will treat this a little bit differently, so make sure you know the rules of different schools in terms of additional application material submitted after a deadline. But there is a little bit of opportunity, because at the end of the day, the school wants those best scores.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. There are some schools that don't allow it, but most do. And so you could literally write a little optional essay saying, I'm not 100% happy with the result that I received on the GMAT exam. I'm taking it on day X, and I will furnish you with the new score as soon as I have it. So that can be done. Obviously not the ideal path.
No.
Ideally you've done it all over the spring and summer and stuff, but it's a path that is available. So standardized tests, as I said, admissions officers themselves don't love taking them, and applicants don't either, but it's a vital piece of this process and a useful tool in the admissions world.
I'm going to finish one more thing just as it occurred to me, Graham. GMAT versus GRE. We've said it really doesn't matter now in admissions which one you take, but we know a few little wrinkles about the different tests. So if math is your strong point, which test do you take?
Well, the GMAT is generally perceived as having...
If English is your stronger point, which test do you take?
Yeah, the GRE. Yeah,
so these are the myths that are out there. Whether they're absolutely supported by substance, I don't exactly know, but that's generally the thought.
Yeah.
That if English language is better for you, then GRE might be the better route. The other really interesting thing, and we don't have time to really talk about it, but the average GMAT scores versus the average GREs at different schools, that's worth examining, because there is a disconnect there that we've identified in our research.
Yeah, a little more leeway schools are using with GRE scores in terms of accepting a broader range of candidates. But so tests are a big piece of the puzzle, and it's something you got to tackle, and ideally you get on it. If you're watching this lesson, get on your GMAT or GRE prep. So our next lesson is going to be all about making your resume, which is another vital piece in this puzzle. So join us for that on the Admissions Academy.